So what makes a good story? What makes a good story? Let's hear a story. Margaret Downey has been the reason why we have the Tree of Knowledge in our lobby every year, and I've invited her to tell a little story.
Thank you, Hugh, and thank you, everyone. I'm fighting a little cold, so please forgive my voice if I crack a little bit. Here we go. In 2003, I started to see that the holiday season did not include me. The Westchester Courthouse had holiday cheer, but only the religious were allowed to be near. Believers in God were welcomed with joy. Non-believers were not, they would surely annoy. A creche with baby Jesus was given a space. A menorah with lights had a great place. I asked, how can non-theists get a chance too? The problem back then was that nobody knew. I conducted a search and asked lots of friends, then gathered ideas for secular trends. We finally settled on one special tree, one that could speak for more than just me. It's important, we thought, to display learning books. Intellectual books would get many looks. The tree needed a name to convey our clear vision. The name Tree of Knowledge was the final decision. In 2007, we got our big chance. Book cover ornaments would hang from each branch. That first Tree of Knowledge was an amazing sight, but soon it would cause a ridiculous fight. The commissioners imposed some made-up new rules in an effort to please some objecting town fools. The books are just wrong, those fools would proclaim, and yelled very loudly, it's the atheist we blame. Year after year, the tree was reduced. The commissioners only had one thing to boost. Religion must reign on the courthouse grounds. We only allow the pious of sounds. It took the commissioners 3 years and a day to force non-theist citizens to just go away. A resolution was passed that stated so clear, non-theists can't show the books they hold dear. That year was 2010. The non-theist crowd could no longer come in. The Santa and choo-choo will suit you just fine. Your books are not welcome. Get rid of your pine. Each year since that time, non-theists have pleaded. They just want equality accepted and heeded. Hundreds of non-theists have presented the case. Each commissioner, however, froze a frown on their face. The Ethical Society jumped into the fray and welcomed the tree in their lobby to stay. It's been 7 years and people are happy. The ethical books make the tree look quite snappy. Please also place a Tree of Knowledge in your very own home. Non-theists of all types will tell you, Shalom.
So, what makes for a great story? Well, good storyteller. A better first line than what makes a great story. So I picked a couple of great first lines, invitations into stories from some of the greatest authors of the world. One, when the author pulls you in and makes you curious. My favorite is Gabriel Garcia Marquez's first line of 100 Years of Solitude. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember the distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. What's going on? Authors also draw you in when they set the scene and offer a challenge, like Hemingway did in The Old Man and the Sea. First line. He was an old man who fished alone in a skiff on the Gulf Stream, and he had gone 84 days now without catching a fish. The challenge is there. Authors can draw you in when they touch hope, like Zora Neale Hurston in Their Eyes Were Watching God. First line. Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. C.S. Lewis made you smile. There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. And also a first line that rhymes and has rhythm helps, such as in 2003, I started to see that the holiday season did not include me. Margaret Downey, 2017. But I've been practicing, and I felt it was ironic that I'm not really telling you a story today. And one reason is I don't think I'm a good storyteller because I violate over and over the one rule of great storytelling, which is don't tell, show. Or, as I like to explain it to people, don't explain, illustrate. I think I'm more of an explainer. I tell better than I show. Because great storytellers paint pictures in your mind that are evocative, that enter your psyche sweetly and softly and fill you and sustain you. So I had to ask people for help. And my wife Maureen was the first one to remind me once again that there's more to the literary world than nonfiction, Hugh. I had to thank my son Justin, who just this week, in fact on Tuesday, will be finishing up his senior project at Hampshire College on how interviewers can draw narratives and weave stories. I also got help from ethical culture leaders, Joan Johnson Lewis, Randy Best, James Croft, Jay Hooper. And I asked my favorite fiction writer, Mary Kay Zaravaleth, who told me of E.M. Foster's advice about storytelling. 2 words, only connect. Only connect. If a storyteller fails to connect, they're really not telling a story in some ways. He goes on, Forster says, only connect the prose and the passion, and both will be exalted, and human love will be seen at its height. Live in fragments no longer. Live in fragments no longer. Stories unify and inspire. Good stories can be very cleansing, in a sort of capital R romantic kind of way. Romantic writers write often about the power of natural forces, and they come through human life, sometimes devastating human life, and other times inspiring and cleansing it. Great natural forces can remind us not to sweat the small stuff too much, so it can be therapeutic. Rumi wrote, a story is like water that you heat for your bath. It takes messages between the fire and your skin. It lets them meet, and it cleans you. Obviously, storytelling is a deeply primal experience, something that has happened for eons around campfires. You hear stories of storytelling all the time, where people in the flickering glow draw people together and take turns in telling stories all over the world before the invention of writing. So it was an oral tradition to start. And certain groups without oral traditions, and especially groups that are spread out and not in urban centers, create culture by their stories. Since they're not right with each other, they have to put their mores and their social customs into stories, and that's how people are held together as a group. The Arab culture, particularly nomadic in many cases, put together many of these stories and also included Turkish and Jewish and Indian folklore in the book called 1001 Nights. This collection, or part of it, you may know and portrayed in many films and other forms as Arabian Nights. And Randy Best, the leader of the Northern Virginia Ethical Society, spoke about Arabian Nights a while ago, and he pointed out that storytelling has a framing device. And often it's that you tell a story about a story. So Sherazade is the narrator in Arabian Nights, and she's going to be killed after she tells the king a story. But she stops the story at a very substantial moment and says, well, I'll finish tomorrow. And so the king goes, oh, okay. So she gets another day of life. And the next day she finishes that story, but then starts another one and stops at a very exciting moment. Kind of like when Netflix ends and like it'll start in 30 seconds. Well, I gotta watch it now. And this went on for 1,001 nights until the king had fallen in love with her. Stories saved her life. The narrator in that book says people need stories more than bread itself. They tell us how to live and why. Now, one of my favorite stories is The Princess Bride. I got that family story through watching the film format. It originated in a 1973 book by William Goldman, who reframed it from a screenplay, into a screenplay from his book, and then that screenplay was produced into a film by Rob Reiner. And in that film, a grandfather reads a story to his boy, his grandson. And my wife and I just listened to the story of that, read by Carrie Ooles on a book on tape called The Making of the Princess Bride. So look at the frames that were created. We listened to a story, about a bedtime story that was turned into a film. And that's how stories live on when they get old. They get reframed in a new story. And that's what we have to do with all of our stories. I'm going to return to that at the end of my talk today, these framing of stories within stories. I did a little research into the neurological aspects of stories. Stories quite often are in brain science is being shown as a collection of brain firings, and these firings get embedded in us as habits. And they create positive patterns, and they make sense out of chaos. And these habits get ingrained because despite Bob's caution about that song, the first line I did a Emmylou Harris, Lord, came right out. Because it's embedded in us. Stories and words flow through us and the synapses are put into our brain in a way. We crave that order. James Croft, who's the outreach director for the St. Louis Ethical Society, said, we are addicted to stories as a species. For a number of years, actually, James has been talking about how ethical culture and humanism in general has to do a better job of telling stories. Because in a lot of religions, they get why stories are important. I mean, millions of Christians will say the story of Jesus is the greatest story ever told.
Then they knock on doors.
And they knock on doors. Millions of Buddhists talk about the story of Gautama, who goes out of his palace to try to find the meaning of life, only to see that it's been in front of him all the time. Stories weave this cultural power for a lot of religions. So maybe we have to do a better job. What is humanism's story? James says that humanism needs to learn to communicate if we're going to make the 21st century the century of humanism. Susan Jacoby, a secularist atheist writer, says that we must reclaim the language of passion and emotion from the religious right. Because that's a power. It's a cultural power. So why aren't we telling our stories well? Why aren't we using them? And some think it's because we too exclusively rely on reason. And I think I probably contribute to that over-reliance, given my strong preference for nonfiction over fiction. But when I hear about storytelling, I do think about it as connecting to facts. I love historical stories. I love stories about things that you see, things that happen, observable data. And then I put them together using induction and deduction to create, for me, a map of the world. So stories help me create this map. But some say that this obscures the passion, that it basically overlooks what cannot be explained in words. It's similar to the poet Keats, who criticized the scientific project by criticizing Sir Isaac Newton, saying that he unweaved the magic of the rainbow. That through scientific analysis, that wonder was gone. So is connecting to what is through science to blame for the fact that humanists don't have great storytelling? I don't think so, because I love those stories. There's a book that James recommended to me called The Storytelling Animal, How Stories Make Us Human, by Jonathan Gottschall. And in it, Gottschall says, science adds to wonder, it doesn't dissolve it. Scientists quote, "The more they discover about their subject, the more lovely and mysterious it becomes." Gottschall says that, quote, "This left me in awe of our species, of this truly odd primate that places story at the very center of existence." Now, obviously humans are diverse, which is why we all see stories differently, I think. Thank goodness. And while I personally may feel a great deal of passion through Carl Sagan's description of the universe as it is, others feel that scientific explanation is too restrictive. So if humanism is going to get out more to the public, we have to do a better job of supplementing our explanation of the world with great stories. We have to speak to the passion. We got the reason part pretty damn. I think storytelling actually may offer a compromise or some common ground between rationalists and artists. Because there's something universally appealing to good stories. I mean, I find definitions very useful, but Hannah Arendt, the philosopher, was right, I think, in saying storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it. So maybe we have to ask our scientific community to explain meaning without defining it. We do have some great storytellers. I mean, one of my favorite is Neil deGrasse Tyson. If you haven't watched The New Cosmos, I urge you to. That's a story of the universe, and it is in story form. He does a great job of using facts to tell stories. I taught 25 years of history, and the thing I was always amazed at was my students always said, "Well, do we have to know the facts for this?" And for me, the story was the facts. I told the story through facts. So I didn't see the distinction. For me, the facts were full of passion. But that's where I was coming from. I took that jumble of names and dates and I tried to create an unfolding that brought my students in. But broad perspectives on history don't intrigue everybody. I've come to realize I don't get it. But most people actually want to understand their own past, their own personal history. And that's what stories do too. They help make sense of that past that's your own. Your personal memories, your dreams. It makes sense of even the moments that are lost in time. I love the way British writer Graham Swift describes this map making that we do for our own lives. He says, "Man is the storytelling animal. Wherever he goes, he wants to leave behind not a chaotic wake, not an empty space, but the comforting marker buoys and trail signs of stories." He has to keep on making them up. As long as there's a story, it's all right. Even in his last moments, it is said, in the split second before a fatal fall, or when he's about to drown, he sees passing rapidly before him the story of his whole life. End quote. So to me, I look at history and science as talking about what has been and what is. For me, it's a story. It's one of the reasons why I've reserved for my holiday reading coming up Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens, A Brief History of Mankind. What a great story. In less than 500 pages, you can't get better than that. I'll tell you about that when I get back. But it tells the story of our identity as a species, and it helps us understand where we came from. It offers us those trail markers. I want to turn now to a terrain that's a little less familiar to me, and that's away from facts, away from connection to the present as it is, or the past as it was. I want to imagine the future as it might be. And in the storytelling animal, Gottschall comes up with a new term for human beings, homo fictus, fictional man. Because not only are we storytelling animals, we also demonstrate the unique human quality of being able to do make-believe. Maybe some other animals do, I don't know, it's possible. But we do that a lot. We try to imagine different worlds. For decades, one of the best storytellers in the ethical culture movement was Arthur Dobrin, who was the leader emeritus of the Long Island Society. And he talked about one book that he wrote 20 years ago called Love Your Neighbor, Stories of Values and Virtues. And he said just last month somebody came up to him and said, "That was my favorite kid's story." So when we gather around the tree of knowledge, I want you to be ready to share just the title of your favorite kid's story, briefly. Let that come to mind. But curiously enough, not everybody in the ethical culture movement appreciated this book. In fact, in one certain situation, one leader heard somebody saying about this book in a sort of scoffing manner. You'll notice there are rabbits on it, and in it, the rabbits talk. So they said, "Animals don't talk." Right? That's true. That's true. So a few others may have critiqued a children's book this way, but in fact, Free Inquiry magazine, which is out of the Center for Inquiry, in discussing myths and stories, said that basically writing fiction was lying. Now, this has actually got a long tradition in the rationalist history. Plato himself actually didn't like dramatic productions because he said, well, you're faking an incident and people are crying and laughing. You're making fake emotions. You're misleading people thinking something is real when it's not. He actually didn't like sculpture either. Realistic sculptures by Plato. Zenos, the great sculptor here, I'm sure knows this. Plato would criticize sculptures because you're trying to make somebody think that's a real person when it's not. Now, I've never heard a kid who says, "Tell me a story," say, "Wait a minute, that's made up." That's part of the point of myths and stories. Tell me a story is one of the most endearing requests a child can make because it's an invitation to a relationship. It's an invitation to get close to each other, whether in front of a fire or one last book before the light goes off to go to bed. It's an invitation to be a collaborator in make-believe. Now, obviously, storytelling has a lot of other benefits. Educational experts talk about children who are told stories, not just true ones, but make-believe too, have, quote, more active imaginations, greater confidence, superior language skills, and they're more able to cope with their feelings. Because when a child hears a story where it's intense in their emotions, they can practice feeling these feelings without the intensity of a real-life situation. And they're better able to handle life when it really does come back down the pipe. But more importantly, I think, for me, as an ethical leader, is that stories carry moral messages. They allow children to think through a situation. What would I do if I was that rabbit planting a garden and my child was stealing what I was planting? These sorts of situations are often, in some ways, the beginning of conscience, moral conscience. Daniel Taylor, author of another good book, Tell Me a Story, said, "At the heart of all stories is choice, the necessity of choosing coupled with the uncertainty of consequences. Stories abound with questions of ought and are therefore a powerful, if imprecise, embodiment of humankind's preoccupation with right and wrong." And the thing about stories, the ability to show uncertainty is very important because a lot of times rational approaches to ethics is, well, if you line up all the categories, you can come up with a calculation that's going to tell you what's the right thing to do. Life's not like that. Life is messy and unpredictable, and stories capture that well. So I think we have to approach storytelling in a way that's different. So I try to tell stories, and I'll try one last story to conclude. Many of you know this story, some of you don't. It's Felix's story. There once was a boy named Felix who rode in a great big boat. Felix and Mama and Papa, brother Isaac and Sarah, sailed from Germany to a new home. Papa Samuel was to be the new rabbi of a temple. It was there that Samuel challenged religious traditions that no longer helped people. He said that men and women could sit together in service and wondered why kosher laws still existed if they no longer made you healthier. He was changing his religion to be in modern times. Meanwhile, Felix's mother, Henrietta, worked with other members of the temple to do no less than to heal a broken world. That was their mission. They went to places where people were suffering, to dockyards of New York, to apartments full of hungry families, to children's homes where orphans lived. And Felix went with her. And it was there that he learned that people suffer every day. He learned the habit of helping them. He learned what he called his duty. He listened to that small, still voice within. As he grew into a teenager, that voice grew louder. He practiced bringing out the best of people. He taught children at the temple how to help those with too little food or too little work, to help those crowded in tenements. Felix wanted to grow up to be like his parents, maybe be a rabbi. He did very well in school and went to Europe to finish his studies. But Felix started to see the world very differently from his parents. Felix said that his parents would pray to God to help those do good works, but that one day, he said, he just stopped praying. He knew that he would have to follow his own path. It was the path through the world before his eyes. He came back to America wanting to be good without God. So Felix started the ethical societies where he spoke not of God, but of treating people well, a place where people could be inspired and supported to make the world a little better every day. He organized meetings in New York for those wanting to honor worth, build justice, and grow relationships with people from different backgrounds, from different races. He organized nurses to visit the poor, schools to teach everyone, committees to keep children out of factories. He helped others make other ethical societies in Philadelphia and Chicago. He did it for so long that when he died in 1933, people didn't know how to tell their own story, because Felix always told it. Of course, they could read what he said to them, or they could try to live like he did, but one important lesson that Felix taught them was that they would have to find their own path in life, their own way to be good in their own time and place, because the times are changing, so we have to change too. Life after Felix challenged ethical societies because there were wars, there were battles for civil rights, there was the destruction of the planet. How could we do what Felix did today? We still come together to inspire and support, but we can no longer look to Felix for help. So we must listen to that small, still voice within. We must listen to each other who come together. And we must listen to all those beyond our walls that may be different from us. Change is not always easy, because only men used to tell the stories. Now today, the 3 largest ethical societies are led by women. Now ethical societies are trying to reach out to address issues of racism and the criminalization of poverty. Now they're trying to reach out and bring more people to the table so that everybody can tell their story. Some of that means getting past the past of moving beyond Felix. That's just what he would have wanted. He would want us to be good without God, good with each other, and good without him. Thanks for listening to that half-baked story. I hope you help me reframe it in new ways. Because we tell that story over and over again. The world changes around us. That story doesn't fit. And we have to make a new story. I'm not a great storyteller. We're making it together. Please join me. Thank you very much.